Okay, we're in our second week of 20th century American literature. And again, we can't cover all the material that is available. There's just not enough time. But I want to highlight some of the major movements and factors. And I think we'll be splitting this up into two decades this week. Looking at the 1920s through 1930s, the Jazz Age was the most influential element. Now, the Jazz Age really was this time of social upheaval. Lots of money was pouring into America. That money led to a lot of leisure time, a lot of money that was just available to spend. We also had some other issues going on. We had a lot of immigration as Europe was having some famines, and so people were escaping. America's stock market was in a tremendous bubble slash boom, which, as we can well know now, was doomed. We saw the movement of African Americans who used to be in slavery moving up north, and with their movement, bringing a whole different set of cultural and artistic elements, including jazz and the blues and um, different dancing and uses of other musical instruments, which really changed the artistic pace of the cities. The cities started growing more. There was much more urbanization. Women started to feel more empowered. We saw the rise of the suffragette movement, which gained so much power when they combined with the temperance movement. And the two movements were able to put in power not only the ability for women to get the right to vote, but to outlaw alcohol. Alcohol became outlawed. This led to the rise of a new item in America: gangsters, Boardwalk Empire, the mob, and so on. Perhaps the greatest novel to represent this age was The Great Gatsby, full of partying, dancing, alcohol. Party till you drop, and drop they did. And of course, the Gatsby did not end well. We saw Cotton Club and the Harlem Renaissance go into full swing. For our short stories, we're going to be looking at, ironically, we're not looking at F. Scott Fitzgerald, even though his novel was the epitome of this age. We're going to be looking at Sherwood Anderson and Ernest Hemingway. Sherwood Anderson was famous for a lot of short stories that dealt with regionalism. His main collection of short stories, Winesburg, Ohio, is considered a classic example of regionalism. And then we have Ernest Hemingway. Hemingway is kind of like this man's man, very much dealt with the idea of masculine themes such as fighting, war, hunting, fishing. Hemingway was first and foremost a journalist, though, and his style reflected that. So our Sherwood Anderson example is called Brothers. Anderson himself had a difficult childhood and a somewhat difficult adulthood as well. He was married at least 4 times and even had a mental breakdown and was institutionalized briefly. His writings focused heavily on character development. And while he is most famous for Winesburg, Ohio, the story you're reading here, Brothers, is another classic example of his. Here we have a narrator who's slightly unreliable. After all, he knows the man that he meets lies all the time, but yet he completely accepts his last story, his most ridiculous story. The key elements of the short story, though, are the following lines, and listen to them. "We are brothers," he said again. "We have different names, but we are brothers. Our father, you understand, went off to sea." So why is this so important? Well, the man and the murderer are not brothers by blood, but rather by this kind of cultural identity. The man sees in himself the disillusionment, frustration, and passionate desire that is in the murderer. The murderer kills his wife not out of hatred or even anger or passion, but out of boredom. He just wants something else. And that quality, the man suggests, is something that exists universally. So they are brothers. They are brothers in this type of man they've become. Our second short story is Ernest Hemingway's My Old Man. This may be a slightly different Hemingway than what have read in the past. You may have read The Sun Also Rises. Lots of Hemingway's stuff is set in Spain. There's lots of bullfighting, or some of his stuff is set with big game hunting, or in Africa, or we have The Old Man and the Sea, fishing. He dealt with the Spanish Civil War as well as World War I, and some of his books reflect those wars. This short story deals about horse racing, steeplechase in specific, not horse racing around just a track, but steeplechase goes through different sections, like there might be a jumps or mazes type stuff. And it's kind of cross country. And of course, gambling. And like many of Hemingway's stories, this has what we call the iceberg effect. Hemingway, they say an iceberg, you see just, 10% of the iceberg. You're seeing just the tip above water. Underneath water is this mountain. And that's what Hemingway does. He just gives us the tip of the narrative, and we have to guess what is below. In this, our narrator is a young man who doesn't quite connect the dots, but gives us, the reader, enough information to connect them for him. So he doesn't understand, for example, the world of gambling and throwing races. But yet when his father's friend, George Gardner, tells his father what horse to place the bet on, we get the connection at the end when the horse that had the low odds wins. And the father said that George Gardner was such a wonderful jockey, yet he lost on a more powerful horse. We get that he was throwing the race. But our narrator is young. He idolizes his father, and he doesn't see the criminal element there. Hemingway also is very famous for his style of writing. He writes, he doesn't give us real flowery descriptions. He tends to write in a more journalistic style, giving us the facts without too much emotion and letting the story kind of play out rather than leading the reader as much. And we can see that in this story as well, even though it is from the point of view of a child. I'm just going to focus on one poem from the Harlem Renaissance. I gave you a section to look at, and you can look at a couple of the Harlem Renaissance poems. But what we're starting to see now in the Harlem Renaissance is a bit of Black empowerment coming. And Claude McKay, who is also an activist as well as a poet, starts us off with this poem, which I wanted to share. If we must die. If we must die, let it not be like hogs, hunted and penned in an inglorious spot, while round us bark the mad and hungry dogs, making their mock at our accursed lot. If we must die, oh, let us nobly die, so that our precious blood may not be shed in vain, or even the monsters we defy shall be constrained to honor us through dead. O kinsmen, we must meet the common foe. Though far outnumbered, let us show us brave, and for their 1,000 blows deal one death blow. What though before us lies the open grave? Like men we'll face the murderous, cowardly pack, pressed to the walls, dying, but fighting back. So suddenly we're starting to see the Black empowerment begin. And the Harlem Renaissance, because of its protection in a way of Black businesses, Black entertainment, and Black entrepreneurs giving money to a Black community, they started to feel the comfort of empowerment. They got away from the fear of the Jim Crow South and the Ku Klux Klan. And we start to see the rise of civil rights leaders demanding more from their country, more from society. And this poem starts, and we're going to look at another one next week by Langston Hughes, which continues this empowerment idea. The other thing about the Harlem Renaissance poems is we start to see the influx of musicality, jazz, the blues. We start to see this combination of music in the poetry, and that becomes a new way of poetry to sound. Jazz is filled with dissonant noises, with different keys, and we start to see that reflected in the poetry. It becomes very musical. All right, which brings us to the 1930s. 1929, the big one. The Great Depression hits. And of course, not only does it affect America financially, but culturally as well. And the literature reflects that. Everything reflects that. America lost its mojo in a way. I mean, we were running high in the jazz age, spending money like crazy, gambling away, and suddenly the money ran out. The Great Depression hit hard. So the endless party and money of the 1920s resulted in the crash of 1929 and the Great Depression that followed. America and many other countries in the world had been flowing with seemingly nonstop money. And don't forget, the Great Depression wasn't just an American phenomenon. It really was a worldwide phenomenon. And some of the Great Depression resulted from bad actors in the stock market. But some also rose from the growing tensions in Europe due to a difficult resolution of World War I. So our first story we're going to look at grabs the connection between the flow of the jazz age and the harsh reality of what follows. Our main character, Charlie, parties himself into a stay at a sanitarium, during which his wife dies from heart trouble. His sister-in-law gains custody of his daughter, and Charlie cannot regain that custody or her trust. So this is F. Scott Fitzgerald's Babylon Revisited. And as I said, The Great Gatsby was the epitome of the jazz age. But Babylon Revisited is the wake-up call. Much of F. Scott Fitzgerald's work is semi-autobiographical. He, like many of his characters, lived well beyond his means, him and his wife Zelda. and pretended to be part of the world of the wealthy. He had a bit of a strained relationship with Zelda, though he loved her immensely. The two of them also fought passionately. Their fights were legendary. Zelda was not emotionally stable and ended up in a sanitarium a number of times during their marriage. Fitzgerald really captured the essence of the Jazz Age in its glory and its ugliness. And Babylon Revisited looks at the aftermath. Here, Charlie desperately wants to be forgiven for his past, but doesn't want to completely forget it. He kind of wants to paint it over in prettier pictures. Um, in this piece, he mentions a number of times how much he loves his wife Helen, and yet we know that one of the reasons Miriam, his sister-in-law, is so mistrustful of him is because he locked Helen out in the cold. And obviously, the two of them fought bitterly during their marriage. When he lost his money and lost his sanity, went to a sanitarium, an institution. Miriam was supposedly so, his sister, his wife Helen, was so distraught that basically she dies of heart failure. And Miriam doesn't forgive him. And as he's trying to gain back his daughters, having recovered financially, in fact, now he's in a better financial state than Marion and Lincoln Peters, which breeds a little resentment on their parts. He ends up being kind of brought back into the old world by the appearance of two friends who want to party like he partied back in the day when he and Helen would fight. And it is the appearance of these partying friends that Miriam's trust is once again broken, and he loses his opportunity to regain his daughter. But this also starts us in this other issue that starts happening at this time period, and that is the rise of psychiatry. So Freudian psychiatrists became popular in the early part of the 20th century. Not only did many authors have firsthand experience with mental health issues, such as F. Scott Fitzgerald, who spent some time in sanitarium, along with his wife Zelda. We also had Hemingway, who ended up committing suicide. But these authors also dealt with many of the theories of psychology, which begin to find their way into literature. One of these ideas was the idea of the stream of consciousness. And our next author, William Faulkner, became the master of utilizing stream of consciousness writing so that the reader feels like they're in the mind of the character thinking as the character thinks in all its chaotic forms. In fact, in Faulkner's greatest novel, The Sound and the Fury, the reader experiences the stream of consciousness of an individual with a broken mind, someone who's schizophrenic. So Faulkner's also, aside from his stream of consciousness, he's also a master of regional writing. And all of his books were set in Mississippi, in a fictional county called Yaknapatawa, which is based on his real life home. All right, so that finishes us off. And in our last short story, in the Faulkner short story, what you're getting is, again, a short story written with the narrator being a child and from that child's perspective. And we also see a lot of humor here, because while the adults, both as a reader, adult reader, and adults in the book, see what's going on, that Rodney's been, messing around with with married women and stealing from their husbands, embezzling from their husbands. Our narrator, Georgie, only sees the fact that he wants his quarters that Uncle Rodney promises him as bribery for things he does. So it's kind of interesting once again to see this narrator issue. Enjoy reading.